Today's show asks the question, Islam and democracy, does the Muslim vote in Britain count?
It's the run-up to the UK's general election and voters are getting ready to go to the polls. The recent expenses scandal and an overall sense of flawed democracy was what initially prevented the people of Britain from distinguishing between the main parties and from therefore committing their vote. Splitting the election wide open and offering the voter food for thought, leader of the Lib Dems, Nick Clegg, now pulls ahead of the leading two candidates. However, the Muslim community may be facing other issues besides this. Public theology think tank Theos recently told the Muslim News that Muslims are likely to vote Labour, but only 32% of Muslims are absolutely certain to vote, compared with 47% of the population as a whole. Ideologically speaking, some Muslims argue that it's un-Islamic to vote. Then there is the problem of which party to vote for, since the previous two main parties' foreign policies tended to target Muslim countries. And what about those groups of Muslims who, at the very outset, are totally unpoliticised? Some critics believe it appears that Muslims in Britain were expected to engage, but only enough to bring about minimal change, or else they're branded extremist. In other words, they must engage, but just not strategically. Certain incentive groups like Muslim Vote 2010 have been set up to encourage Muslims to go out and vote, if for no other reason than to counter the rise of racist and Islamophobic far-right political parties like the BNP, whose gains have been considerable in recent years.
The Ummah is awakening.
However, the demand and desire for democracy is still widespread, and with such groups as MPAC keen to empower the Muslim community by encouraging them to recognise their importance as citizens, it's obvious that communal identities and the increase in popular political participation remain strong. This week on Islam and Life, we'll be asking the question, Islam and democracy, does the Muslim vote in Britain count?
As we just heard, 30% of the Muslims are voting, and this is an important figure because it shows that the Muslims are involved much less than their fellow citizens in the country. And the first question is this one: is this because they think that Islam is opposed to democracy and there is a contradiction? What is the relationship between democracy and the Islamic principles? This is the first important question. To go to the second one, which is in which way they have to be involved when, for example, you have questions and issues that are perceived by the Muslims as un-Islamic, are not accepted by the Islamic principles. And the last question that we got also in the short VT is really about to which party, on which party, for example, we have to support. The natural or in history, the Muslims were very much supporting the Labour Party, and now it's changing because of what happened in Iraq, for example, and the foreign policy or the domestic policy on security, in which way the Muslims should be involved. So to answer all these questions, I'm joined by Dr. Musharraf Hussain, the director of the Karimia Institute in Nottingham and the chief editor of a family magazine, The Invitation. He's also a trustee of the National Center for Citizenship and Law. Dr. Hussain, thank you for being with us today. Let me start with this first question, because we got lots of controversy in the UK and other Western and European countries when it comes to democracy and even the compatibility between Sharia and democracy. So the perception is it's as if we are dealing with two conflicting universes of reference. What is your first take on this? You have been involved at the grassroots level with many Muslims and for years.
I think the first thing to understand is that Islam lays down for us broad principles. God is the guide, and Islam provides us principles. And God has also embellished and gifted us with something called the intellect, the reason. And Muslims are supposed to use ijtihad. So the Quran and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam lays down very clear and beautiful principles which are based on truth and reality. But that is the compass. The compass facing towards God, that a Muslim is always doing things to seek ibtigha wajhillah, the divine pleasure. But the terrain and the map is constantly changing. Over the 1400 years, the Muslim society, the Muslim community, it has all changed. The Ummah has changed drastically in its terrain, in its geography, but the timeless principles that God has given remain the same. The point I want to make is, we Muslims have been gifted with intellect, and we are supposed to do ijtihad in order to implement the principles and the values encapsulated in the Quran and the Sunnah, in the text. It is our duty as Muslims to actualize and to implement and look for ways and means, what is known as the Sunnah. In fact, when the Prophet ﷺ talks about, man sanna fil Islam sunnatan hasana, this is what it means precisely, that I'm going to leave behind values and principles for you. Your job is to actualize and to implement that. And it's going to vary. And democracy is actually a means of implementing what I would say are two very basic Islamic principles. One is, of course, which is mentioned in the Quran, of shura. Allah says that وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُورَى بَيْنَهُمْ, that it was وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. Okay, and so shura, consultation,
yes.
Taking people's advice and getting them on board. That is what voting is, one way of looking at it. The other very important principle that Islam teaches us is that of musawa, which is, of course, the equality or egalitarianism. We are equal in the sight of God. And so that is what democracy is really about, and voting is, it epitomizes. It's one way, it's not the only way, but it's a very good way of helping us to govern and to achieve the maqasid al-sharia, the purpose, the aims and the objectives of Sharia, really.
Yes.